and welcome this evening to a talk by Fiona McIntyre. It's called Dreaming the Land, and Fiona is an amazing painter, printmaker. Her interest in landscape, trees, water, ancient mythology, poetry, music, and the concept of the passage of time is expressed in a variety of natural media that she uses. She's had a long and distinguished career in places. She's traveled around the world, actually. She trained in drawing and painting at the Edinburgh College of Art, and then moved to Sweden, where she lived for the next 7 years to conduct a second degree in printmaking with someone whose name I won't approach, Grafikskolan. Grafikskolan Forum in Malmö. During her time in Sweden, she won prestigious competitions to make site-specific works for Malmö General Hospital and a fresco technique that she perfected. She later conducted an MA in European Fine Art from Winchester School of Art and studied in Barcelona in that capacity. She's used to responding to many different kinds of environments and finding new ways to express her work. During the lockdown, she participated in an exhibition that I curated, actually, called Shades of Green. And it was based on the Somerset landscape and the observations she's made there. And it was shown at the RUH a year ago, actually, from January to May. She has recently exhibited with me as well in London at the Hansard Studio with some of her wonderful abstract paintings. She has lived in Bath. Lived in Bath, until 2004, and she became a member of the Bath Society of Artists, where she was awarded several prizes 2 years consecutively. She's also been just recently elected, that's what Ruth asked what the ARE is, the Royal Society of Painter and Printmakers, and she's a founding member of the Arborealists. The Arborealists are a group that was founded by Tim Craven, how many years ago?
2014.
2014. And it's a group of painters who mainly paint trees. And so we have a great interest in the outdoors and the environment. Now, she's going to talk today about Dreaming the Land. Dreaming the Land was a project that she took on when she became a resident at the Sidney Nolan Foundation, and she'll tell you about that, where she developed a very symbiotic relationship with the work of Sidney Nolan, and then developed new strategies where she grinds her own pigments and creates amazing, loose, spontaneous works. And she's a good friend as well. So without further ado, Fiona.
Thank you very much for that, Sandra. I'd like to thank Sandra, actually, because she arranged this. So I wouldn't be standing here if she hadn't put this all together. So I was first introduced to the Sidney Nolan Trust I'm just trying to remember when it was. I think it was 2020. I met the then director, Andrew Craven, and then sort of a year later, much to my surprise, he invited me to do this residency, which is really exciting. So I'm going to be talking about the work that I produced during this residency, which was basically over a period of 6 months. And I feel, after what Sandra just told you, the fact that I've lived in so many different places, so from Scotland, Iceland, Sweden, and northern Spain, I feel that it really sort of prepared me for this specific residency, mainly because it started in the depths of winter. So I'll go into that a little bit later. The residency started in 2021. And the accommodation was, they had sort of temporary accommodation. They had a sort of basically a shack for a 1-year resident artists. I was going to be doing a 6-month residency. So basically, I was put up in the old farm, which is an arts and crafts building on the site. And that's where I was staying for the period that I was there. So I broke it down into chunks of time, so sort of 10 days at a time. And then the rest of the time, I made the work back in my studio in Gloucestershire. So I work also from the Gloucestershire print cooperative called GPC, and that's in Stroud. So I was sort of balancing all of these different things in order to produce a body of work. I also had friends living near Prestine, which is where the Sidney Nolan Trust is based, which meant I could also go on recce's, which I felt were really important. So I was also sort of acclimatizing myself with the general environment, the lay of the land, if you like, because I hadn't really been up there before, and it was an interesting part of the world because it's borderland. It's sort of on the borders of England and Wales. Nobody quite seems to know whether it's firmly in Wales or in England, which is sort of, I think is sort of interesting in a way, because then you start asking yourself, what does a border mean in reality? Places that I used as a studio while I was there were the old farm. So I worked from the kitchen. It's a huge, big kitchen. So I set up there to draw. And I also was able to access the library. So I used that as well. And that was really fantastic. So what I found was that having precious time at the Rod, which is what the building is called, really focused my mind in a very laser sharp way. And I worked literally day and night while I was there. I wanted to glean literally every single morsel of inspiration that I could from the landscape, to draw and experiment constantly. And also I wanted to sort of get inside the brain and genius of Sidney Nolan. So it gave me this fantastic opportunity to develop a new body of work, this time entirely using natural mineral pigments and also inks. So I was foraging materials to make the inks and literally mulling the pigment into oil paint. So all of the work is made like that. So that made it sort of, I suppose it gave me that really amazing opportunity to put all my energy into using those materials in a way that I hadn't done before. So, I feel that this experience of conducting a residency and being completely immersed really in the environment of another artist is really useful for any artist at any stage of their career, mainly because it forces us out of our comfort zones. Although I'm very good at, I would say, at moving into new territory, partly because of the fact that I've lived in so many different places and had to keep readapting every time. So, I've never liked to feel complacent. And I don't like to make work that's purely driven commercially, because I feel that it's the death knell of true creativity. And certainly Sidney Nolan was of that mind. So William Blake expressed this very well indeed, by wanting to reverse the premises of materialism, quote, that we should understand that the cosmos is not a mechanism, but a living sacred universe, and that everything that lives is holy. So this is another way of describing how all things in nature are imbued with a life force and not simply made of inert matter. And this is something that I'm very aware of and inject into my own work, one way or another. I believe that Sidney Nolan also recognized this in his support of the Aboriginal community and his depiction of the Australian outback. He also had a great passion for the conservation of vulnerable natural habitats. So Sidney Nolan was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1917, and he grew up in a colonial conservative society, which was in the grip of a terrible depression. His family worked for the Melbourne Tram Company, and the family worked illegally making books because they needed to supplement their income, which is very basic. So in spite of this difficult upbringing, Nolan amazingly became one of Australia's most celebrated artists. And in 1981, he was knighted and awarded a Companion of the Order of Australia. He was also elected an honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and elected a member of the Royal Academy of Arts. And he was one of only 2 artists who have ever been made a posthumous RE. So that's a special title for the Royal Society of Painter Printmakers. So I didn't really know a great deal about Nolan, probably like many people. I associated him with his very well-known Ned Kelly series. But as I discovered, there's an awful lot more to him. And that he's had a fascinating career as an artist, a printmaker, even a set designer, and an innovator. Nolan spent time in London in the 1950s with his first wife, Cynthia, and daughter, Jinx, until she died in 1976. Years later, he married Mary Percival. She was actually the sister of the Australian artist Arthur Boyd, who he became extremely good friends with and would collaborate with, and he spent a lot of time up at the Rod. So in 1983, that was when Nolan and Mary actually bought the Rod. And the Tate Gallery, interestingly, describes him as, quote, working in a wide variety of mediums. His oeuvre is among the most diverse and prolific in all of modern art. He's best known for his series of paintings on legends from Australian history, most famously Ned Kelly, the bushranger and outlaw. Nolan's stylized depiction of Kelly's armor has become an icon of Australian art. So he's really known as the Picasso of Australia. And you can see this fabulous painting here of Ned Kelly. So Nolan was obviously very fascinated by Ned Kelly, and you can sort of see why, because of his background, the fact that, you know, his father had been a convict, shipped over to Australia. They'd had a really tough life. So I guess he sort of, you know, he felt a sort of familiarity with him, perhaps. But he wanted to create a painterly narrative that expressed the essence of wild, untamed Australia. Kelly seemed to be the ideal symbol. He was a sort of Robin Hood figure, railing against persecution by the Victorian police. And Ned Kelly's father had been an Irish convict sent out to Australia to serve a sentence, but died soon after when Kelly was just a boy of 12. Kelly's family were part of something known as the squattocracy. It's a sort of tongue-in-cheek term for the downtrodden. They occupied Crown land in order to graze their livestock. So Ned Kelly was in a constant battle with the authorities. And in 1847, the squatters were able to purchase land for the first time. Kelly was caught and hung in 1880 and became a sort of national hero, mainly for the poor Irish Australians in colonial Australia. So you can see here Ned Kelly's death mask. And he was hung on the 11th of November, 1880. And apparently they say that as the news tightened, he is said to have exclaimed, "Ah, well, I suppose it has come to this." So in total, Sidney Nolan made a series of 27 paintings about Ned Kelly. So as you can imagine, the life of Sidney Nolan is a talk in its own right. So I'm going to move on and explain how his innovation and imagination has fed into the development of my own work. I first met the trustee, Professor David Ferry, at Winchester School of Art while doing my MA. He was head of printmaking at the time. And before beginning my residency, he invited me to spend a day with him cleaning Sidney Nolan's print workshop, which was extremely exciting for me, as you can imagine. It felt like a huge honor, actually. And I also helped him resuscitate some Nolan etchings. I wasn't expecting that, I have to say. So David had found a whole load of these zinc plates just lying around in one of the outhouses, incredibly, and realized that there was something very special about them. So he salvaged them, and they've never been seen before. And they ended up in a fascinating exhibition, which David Ferry curated at the Rod. And it had a reference to the innovative English printmaker Stanley William Hayter, who founded Atelier 17. And Atelier 17 was active between 1901 and 1988. He was an extremely important person in the printmaking world, Stanley William Hayter, and that's another talk in its own right too. But I found that very serendipitous because firstly, Nolan had studied engraving and lithography with Hayter in Paris. But the man that taught me printmaking in Sweden, Professor Bertil Lundberg, who was one of the Swedish surrealists, they call themselves the Imaginists, after Ezra Pound's reading group, in fact. But Lundberg had also been mentored by Stanley William Hayter. So it's interesting how things are interlinked. So he had returned from Paris to Sweden, and he set up his own version of Atelier 17 called Grafikskolan Forum in Malmö, which I attended for 3 years on his tuition. So back at the Rod, we proved these etching plates, myself and David, and I was tasked with inking them up. And Professor Ferry added embellishments using a process called viscosity. So he rolled a second color onto the plate. So you've got two colors from one plate. You can, in fact, using viscosity techniques, you can actually roll a lot of colors on one plate, depending on how deeply you etch it, using different softnesses of rollers and different viscosities of ink. It's a very clever process. So as you can see, the results were spectacular, and they related to the Ned Kelly series, as you can see. The print workshop with Arthur Boyd's printing press, which he'd basically loaned to Sidney Nolan. So that's what's really incredible, that's sitting in the workshop. It had been newly refurbished by Professor Ferry's expertise. But unfortunately, by the time I planned to develop my etchings in the middle of my residency, the print workshop had been mysteriously locked up. So I made them at the GPC Gloucestershire Printmaking Cooperative instead. So here you can see the incredible landscape around the Rod. And in the middle, that's the Rod, that's the actual building. There's a better image that I'm going to show you in a minute, but this gives you an idea. So I was very excited to start. I started in December, which was a very cold month. And the first thing I wanted to do was explore the land that surrounded the house, and it's sort of basically 360 degrees. And it felt to me as if the Rod was being embraced by a circle of hills, woodland, river, and the high vantage point of a disused railway track with really exceptional views across the valley. I got a sense that this location probably reminded Nolan of the Australian outback and the no man's land that's represented in many of his paintings. Certainly Nolan split his time equally between Australia and England, every 6 months, preferring to paint actually back in England in the summer months. So very cleverly, I would say, escaping when it was at its coldest. But he would paint Australia in England, but he wouldn't paint Australia while he was in Australia. And I think that's really interesting. And it's a sort of useful trick that I was using myself, simply because I also had to split my time between Prestine and Cirencester. So this is the Rod. It's a magnificent 17th century Jacobean manor house, and it's got a lot of wood inside it. So it creaks at night, as did the old farm where I was staying, all by myself, I hasten to add. So Nolan's studio, his original studio is on the top floor of this building to the left. And then he also used the out houses as well, together with Arthur Boyd, which are a bit more rough and ready. But it's really a very dark and cold place in the depths of winter. So while I was there, I kept constantly hearing stories of, ghosts. A lot of people had told me that they'd experienced ghosts in both buildings, actually. And some people were so frightened they didn't even want to sleep in the old farm, and that's where I was. And luckily I didn't have any issues in the old farm, but I have to say that I did have an experience while I was drawing in the library at the Rod. And that was very late one evening. I hadn't planned to work so late, but I was so engrossed in what I was doing. And I was told to lock up before I went. I didn't really think too much about what that meant, because I was going, once they lock up, they all go home. And I was the only person there. And then I'd have to walk back from this dark old house up a drive, past loads of old sheds to the old farm. But actually, strangely, I wasn't frightened at all. I don't know why, but maybe I just refused to allow myself to be frightened. Otherwise, it would have been hopeless. So while I was sitting there drawing, I realized that it had got later and later. It was absolutely pitch black outside. So I packed everything up. The library was still nice and warm. It was the only room in the house, actually, that they could warm up easily. And then I had to close this massive door. I used the torch on my phone, and then I had to walk through this huge big manor house to the kitchen and go through a back corridor out of the house. And at one point I sort of turned around just as I was passing this massive staircase that's very creaky and crooked and goes all the way up to the original studio of Sidney Nolan. And I swear that I saw something. It just went across my vision of sight. And so I just had to grit my teeth and just get out as quickly as possible. Anyway, yeah, I've always wanted to see a ghost. So, yeah, very interesting, in fact. So I think, in spite of the cold and the darkness, I think I was sort of well equipped from my years of living in Scandinavia, and I sort of relished it in a strange way. In fact, I often find winter is a really useful time to develop work, to develop new ideas. I see it as a sort of time of planting seeds, really, and you sort of go a bit inside yourself, and you can achieve a lot, I think. And I suppose it sort of stops you from getting depressed as well. You just have to get on and make work. So Sidney Nolan was also a collector of objects. And he bought these things through auctions. And I learned about this. I was allowed to go into one of the barns, and it was absolutely packed full of all of these items that he collected over the years. And a sort of penny dropped, and I realized this was in a way a great stepping stone into his mind. It was a way it was a sort of starting point for me, really. And so 2 enormous animal skulls were brought to the old farm. And that's where I was drawing, all by myself, middle of the night sometimes, just sitting there in the kitchen. I can make lots of cups of tea, and in fact, I was living on curry. I'd arrive, and the first thing I would do is I'd make a huge big curry, and then I'd just find different ways of serving it up with salads and things, and I would literally eat that for 10 days. So I didn't have to worry about cooking all the time. I think that was the point. I could just get on and make art. So yeah, these really, for me, became metaphors for landscape. But also for the mass extinction of species, which began feeding into the rest of my work, as you'll see later on. The elephant skull is really loaded with emotion and poignancy, and I felt definitely very humble drawing it, and very aware that this magnificent creature had once roamed the African plains in freedom. So I don't know its end, but perhaps through drawing it, I felt I could immortalize it and honor its spirit. You can see the incredible texture when you look at it close up. These are the drawings, or some of the drawings that I made. I used something called sanguine pencils, and that was it, nothing else. And it's a Latin word which means sanguis, or blood. And in medieval medicine, it describes somebody with a ruddy complexion. It was used a lot during the Renaissance by Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael as ideal for rendering human flesh and creating a sense of volume. So I felt it was a perfect medium to explore these skulls and give the drawings a sensitivity and, in a way, a sort of eeriness. So I tipped the enormous skull up with the jaw so that it looked almost, sorry, without the jaw, because the jaw was the heaviest part of the whole skull. You'd imagine that the main skull would weigh an absolute ton, but it was the other way around. It was actually the jaw that's in the middle that weighed a huge amount, and it took 2 fully grown men to lift it. So when you tip it up, what you're looking at actually are the tusk holes, but they look like eye sockets. So I sort of felt that there was something quite surreal about it. And also looking at the surface of the bone, it sort of reminds me of the surface of rocks and tree bark. So really, as organic organisms, we're all related, and we'll all go back to the earth to replenish it, just like the elephant. The Trust were generous in allowing me to access the lockup where many of Nolan's paintings are stored, and they're not stored at the Trust, they're stored in another town, in fact. So it was there that I discovered Sidney Nolan's painting, which is simply called Head Gallipoli, painted in 1959 with polyvinyl on hardboard. The Gallipoli series constitute a personal and a public lament. It's commemorating the death of Nolan's brother in this military campaign, but it's also something that cost an awful lot of Australian lives. So in a way, I was making my own version of Gallipoli called What Might Have Been. And this is a line from a T.S. Eliot poem, Burnt Norton. But instead of focusing on human lives lost, I wanted to create a metaphor for the mass extermination of species still happening in Africa and symbolized by elephants. So I've painted this with various mineral pigments. It's on a base coat of Naples yellow. The sky is thin layers of lapis lazuli. And I've also worked with cinnabar, which is a red pigment that looks a lot like blood, and also ochre and bone black. So they're all extremely relevant and pertinent to the subject and what I was trying to express. In the old farm where I was staying, and I know that some people found this particularly creepy. So there was a staircase that was already creaky enough that you had to navigate to go up to your bedroom. But there was a further staircase, a smaller one, that went right up into a small attic. And I know some people were absolutely terrified about what was up there. It was a sort of locked door. But I got access to this room. And it was actually filled with paraphernalia that was left behind by Nolan. And one of the objects was this rather mangy sort of stuffed bird of no description. I have no idea what type of bird it is. I don't know if anybody here would know. But I just thought it was quite compelling, and I brought it downstairs to draw it as a study to go towards paintings. And also, after drawing the giraffe skull, which is on the left, which also was enormous, by the way, I felt that the giraffe looked a bit like a bird and a lot like a dinosaur. So in some funny way, the bird related to the previous drawings that I'd made. And these first forays were a paper trail through Nolan's brain, and they eventually took me into his library, where I began exploring his book collection, and I stumbled across a book called Fabulous Beasts and Demons by Heinz Murder. I was also researching more of Nolan's paintings and seeing strange flying creatures, which in turn started to pour into my own work. And I don't really know what it meant, but you follow your intuition, and it felt like the right direction to go in. And so I just went with it. So this is the book. And it's an anthology, really. It's an anthology through the ages and across the world. I was absolutely fascinated by it, and it felt like an important part of a jigsaw. So you can see these are pages from my sketchbook. This is working with ink that I've made myself from blackthorn berries and also saffron. They've been used, or saffron has been used in particular for centuries by the Persians, and it's still used, I believe, to illuminate sacred manuscripts. So the preparation of saffron itself is considered to be a sacred act, and it's prepared with great love and respect by the Persians. Most ink is made with rainwater because you don't want impurities in the ink. But the Persians use rose water, which has got a really amazing aroma, and I believe they think that it's also adding to the sacredness. And I did have a go at making it actually with rose water, and it was gorgeous. So this is in the library where I made several drawings of these rather beautiful objects. So you've got this sort of, it looks like a cross between a bull and possibly a dragon. I don't know, it could be a dinosaur, a rhinoceros, or all of them. And no one really knew anything about it at the Nolan Trust, but it's possibly Chinese by the looks of it. And then also the vessel with the open mouth, that's an Amlash Iranian zoomorphic ceremonial vase. It's used in burials and various rituals. So you would pour, I guess you'd pour wine into your mouth from its open mouth. So it's medieval or even older. I think they can go all the way back to the Neolithic, or at least the Bronze Age. So it felt genuinely very thrilling drawing these absolutely exquisite objects. And I was working on Fabriano paper, which I love drawing on. I like it because it's very smooth and I feel you can do a lot of things with it. And maybe in a way it reminds you of copper plate, which I work with. Copper plate is very, very smooth, and you can actually achieve a lot with it. You can create a lot of different textural effects. Well, I was rubbing raw pigment into the Fabriano paper and fixing it, and then drawing back into it just with different grades of pencil to try and capture. There was a sort of exquisiteness to these objects, and I suppose I was trying to express that. And also they're standing on, it's an old printmaking etching table, or inking up table, should I say. And it was very sympathetic, I felt, to these beautiful objects. So these are the finished drawings. And you can see the effects on the paper with the pigment. So I was working flat on the ground and just chucking pigment on them and rubbing into them with a cloth and then fixing them. So just created these sort of very spontaneous marks. So it was a sort of bit of a contrast between the spontaneity of the way I've applied the colored background, and then there's a lot of detail with the drawing on top of it. So back in the Gloucestershire Print Cooperative, I developed this series of copper etchings. So each one is made with 2 copper plates, so you've got 2 colors. And they're inspired by mystical flying creatures, skulls and anamorphic tree creatures. So the one in the middle, mystical tree creature with wings, is made of a sort of human-like form that's been spliced together with what looks like wings. It's the fossilized remains of seaweed. And so I was just sort of splicing bits and pieces together to see what would happen. And by doing that, it transmogrifies into wings. That's how we make sense of it. So it also alludes to the landscape around the rod, which is steeped in sea fossils, which date back to the Pleistocene. And the Pleistocene lasted from 2.58 million to 11,700 years ago, when the whole region was under sea level. And this brings me to more experimental works. So I made a whole series of these collages out of photographs that I'd taken and images from magazines. And it's a method of free association, often used by the surrealists as a way to access the unconscious mind without the rational brain dictating. And I find it's a really useful way to develop new paintings, and something I'm sort of increasingly doing. So you can see how I've mixed up sort of fossils and bone and wings to sort of create this imaginary creature, as I call it. Hanging in the library when I arrived at the Rod, and for the duration of the time that I was there, was this painting of Sidney Nolan's on the right. And it's a landscape with a cloud that's morphing into a giant bird, which I just really love. It was one of several of his paintings, which included flying creatures, birds, sort of symbolic flying creatures, some of which look invented to me. And in his painting, Pretty Polly Mine, this is very much a surreal image of a suited man who is standing in an industrial Australian landscape looking a bit sort of out of place. And above him is flying a rather enormous parakeet. So I think what is interesting about these works is that Nolan had used a media called Ripolin, and in his studio after his death, about 30 cans of this spray paint was discovered in about 19 different tints. And he loved using this because it dried really rapidly. And also it was available in gloss and, you know, matte as well. So he found it very appealing. And also because he was so intuitive in the way that he worked, and he liked to be very spontaneous. So he also liked to combine this in the works that he produced, the Celtic works, which you'll see a little bit later, where he could combine Ripolin with, say, oil and water to create organic patterns. You know, when you put two disparate mediums together, then really interesting things start happening. And I recognize this desire within Nolan because when I paint, I also like to work rapidly and freely, which I know is it's sort of the opposite of how I draw. So the drawing for me is usually, it's an exploration really, and it leads me on to, I suppose, paring stuff back, and I'm slowly becoming a bit more semi-abstracted. But the painting is a different process for me. Nolan was, for me, something of a kindred spirit, and he also used other materials such as boot polish, dyes, secondhand canvas, tissue paper, old photographs, and household paints. And I've also experimented over the years with lots of different materials while I was in Edinburgh, but also in Sweden. I did a lot of experimenting, and then at the trust and in my studio. So, you know, using things like, again, cut up canvas, which I've done some interesting things with, including applying silver leaf onto it and then sort of pasting it onto a canvas so that it looks quite almost sort of slightly three-dimensional. Torn paper, inks and acrylics, pigments, and also melted wax. So I went through a period of playing around a lot with encaustic when I was in Sweden, and then later on when I was here in Bath. And I feel that it keeps an artist on their toes, and it prevents, crucially, it prevents stagnation. So after making this painting, which is called Go, 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 said the bird, humankind cannot bear very much reality. And it's got the wrong date on it, by the way. It wasn't 1948. I don't know where that crept in. So obviously that was made while I was resident at the Sidney Nolan Trust. But it was inspired by one of my favorite vantage points around the rod, which was a disused railway track, which is quite high up. And it was looking across a flooded field and hills beyond. So discovering Nolan's painting Pretty Polly Mine, I found a real synergy between the landscape and my flying creature. So above the railway track, in my painting, flies this strangely sort of anamorphic creature, which is sort of part bird, part skull. And on the tree-lined riverbank, if you look, there is an elephant starting to emerge. So the title comes from T.S. Eliot's poem Burnt Norton, as so many of my paintings' titles do. And I discovered by looking through Nolan's library that he also read T.S. Eliot, and he must have found the words prescient in the wake of World War II. I was also aware of the war being waged in Ukraine, and that was affecting, I think it was affecting me because, you know, you couldn't get away from it. It was everywhere. If you check your phone, you know, you'd be bombarded with some of this stuff. So perhaps the painting is also a result of how I was feeling in the depths of winter, alone and in a state of limbo. As I mentioned earlier, the views from all sides of the rod are spectacular, and one really feels ensconced in the bosom of the land, enfolded into its fossil-embedded hills, which are marinated literally in prehistory and dragon myths as well. I imagine that early humans discovering the skulls of dinosaurs and the fossils of sea creatures might have believed that fire-breathing giants roamed the earth and flew through the air. So you can see a sketchbook to the left, and it's painted with hand-mulled watercolor paints. So I've made them into watercolor by mixing raw pigments with gum arabic, glycerine, ox gall, honey, and water, and it makes a paste which dries really sort of hard, like a hard cake. And in March, it was bitterly cold, as it often is. It felt actually several degrees colder at the rod, and I was able to compare that because I'll be going back to Gloucestershire. Yeah. I would be having to dress up quite a lot, wear lots of thermals, and take a hot flask of tea with me as well. So the drawing on the right, that's a larger drawing, actually. That's done on a big drawing board that I take out with me too. Sit outside until I was so numb with cold that I couldn't go on any longer, but I'm pretty dogged, so it takes a lot before I give up. But I made that with, I took little jars of dried pigments. I was doing the sort of rubbing the pigments into the paper and fixing it and drawing back into it with charcoal. So that's lapis in the background. That beautiful blue is genuine lapis lazuli, and then yellow ochre in the foreground. And of course, that fed into the previous painting. Where did I find it? Well, I've got some raw lapis. That's a whole other story. It does, yes. Yeah, I have got a genuine big piece from Afghanistan, but it's extremely hard, and it's a hell of a thing to prepare it yourself. I've had a go at it, but it's better to actually buy it pre-prepared, if I'm honest. Especially if you want the vibrant blue, that's what you need to do, because it's a massive process. And you can see the paints. That's my paint box with, these are all handmade paints that I've made myself, obviously. And so I also, if you go behind the rod, you go in a circle around a really ancient place. It's called Hindwell, and this is the Hindwell Brook that you see. I made lots of drawings here as aid memoirs, painting with watercolor and graphite. It's quick to use, it's easy to carry. So that was quite a small sketchbook on the left, and that fed into another painting. So if we come to this painting here called Remaining a Perpetual Possibility, I've always been very inspired by poetry, and the combination of water and trees. And the reflections creating anamorphic and abstracted forms. I find that really interesting. So the title of the painting reminds me of a favorite poem by Octavio Paz, and he's one of my all-time favorite poets who I refer to over and over again. And there are several poets like that that I love. I've always dipped into poetry and often take the titles of paintings from poems too. But this particular poem is called Letter of Testimony, in which he describes the movement of water and the passage of time. So I'd like to read just a tiny little passage. It's a very long poem, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but for me, it describes this painting so well. And it also reveals how the subconscious mind can rise to the surface and vividly express itself in paintings. I think there's a massive synergy between what poets are doing and what artists are doing. And again, also, there's clearly a huge link between musicians as well. So it goes like this. There is an uncertain territory between night and day. It is neither light nor shadow, it is time. An hour, a precarious pause, a darkening page, a page where I write slowly these words. The afternoon is an ember burning itself out. The day turns, its leaves dropping. A dark river files away at the edge of things. Tranquil, persistent, it drags them along, I don't know where. Reality drifts off. I write, I talk to myself, I talk to you. I wanted to talk to you as the air and this small tree talk to each other, nearly erased by the shadows, like running water, the murmur of an incessant stream, like a still puddle, that reflector of instantaneous shams, like fire, with tongues of flame, a dance of sparks, tails of smoke. So that's all I really want to say about this particular painting, because I feel that nothing else can really express it. Nothing can express it better than that particular passage. And that book of poetry, it's actually called A Tree Within, which Octavio Paz wrote. And some of the pages are almost disintegrating because I've read them so often over the years, and that each time I read them, they take on a different meaning, which I think is very interesting. I also walked to Rodwood. So the whole location is, as I said, it's sort of 360 degrees. So you've got amazing, you see hills literally all around you. The disused railway track. You've got the river, and you've also got a woodland. It's called Rodwood. So that was also owned by Sidney Nolan. So I went up to Rodwood with my drawing gear, and I saw a lot of trees that had been blown down. And that was there was a whole series of violent storms, if people remember, during that period. So I walked, instead of walking all the way up, because it was quite tricky actually with all the fallen trees and extremely muddy as well, trying to climb up quite a steep hill with a big drawing board, which I took with me. So I walked inside the periphery of the wood, and I found some interesting tree forms that really sparked my imagination, and from which I could see faces and sort of human-like forms. So this tree branch across the track, the one on the left, is called para-idolic creature. That means to see faces in something. So it can be any sort of a form, within nature, or it could literally be something that's been man-made, but we can see faces in. It could be the clouds, where you start to see faces, or animals. We're sort of programmed really to do that, interestingly. So when I saw this form just sort of lying across the track, I thought it looked very animal-like. It's almost got a sort of a trunk or something. And I felt that the presence of it seemed to change the whole meaning of the landscape for me. The other painting, Anamorphic Tree Person, that's inspired by looking at vine-clad trees in the wood and seeing human-like forms suggestive of limbs, arms, legs, and a head. And again, you can see, I've sort of listed the pigments that I was using, green earth. Again, when you're using these natural pigments, you have a more, in a sense, you have a more limited palette because some of them don't mix that well together because they're quite fragile. And some of them are opaque and others are more translucent. So you have to work with them more sensitively. But you've got green earth, various ochres, lapis lazuli again, which is really, that's in the para-idolic creature, this water on the land, bone black, and again, Naples yellow, which is the background to all of these paintings. And also you have to work quite rapidly, I find, because it's not like modern paint. It is quite fragile. It doesn't, if you overwork it, you just sort of, you kill it off somehow. So you have to, and I like that. It's sort of, I felt that it worked well with my intentions of wanting to pull back and not overpaint something. So this is all about shapes in small places, sort of getting close to the ground. So this is a sort of another angle on the woodland. So seeing macrocosms or worlds within worlds in rotting tree stumps. And, with the storms just over and the chaos of the global politics, it felt for me like a sort of tranquil and grounding place to be. Hence this title, At the Still Point of the Turning World. So in the end, it's clearly nature that brings us back to ourselves. Again, animal-like creatures appear in this painting. As humans, we want to recognize the familiar, and I think it is definitely encoded within us. Perhaps there's an ancient survival technique to see forms, heads, and creatures, not just in clouds, but also in water, in trees and rocks. And usually when we're relaxed and open to it, we can sort of see them more easily. So this is also another form of surrealism. It's of allowing the inexplicable to rise to the surface for us to make sense of it visually. It's fascinating to me that Nolan took an interest in the destruction of the environment in Australia, and I've felt that it translated back to the rod when he bought so much of the surrounding land in order to protect it. Perhaps more prescient than he might have understood at the time, with the destruction of habitats and the pollution of many rivers in England and Wales. So Nolan's painting Carcass in Swamp was one in a series that recorded actually the worst drought in Australia, where it's hard to get your head around it, 1.25 million cattle died of thirst. And Nolan took many photographs and made drawings. So this painting has a strange beauty to it. The decayed animal has become like a sort of surreal monument to this dreadful disaster. And it's painted exclusively in 2 colors, which increases the sense of melancholy, I think. So this is a painting called Imagined Primordial Landscape. And as you know, I'm a part of a contemporary group of artists called the Arborealists. We're interested in environmental issues, and it's also an underlying theme, I would say, in much of my work, although not necessarily always so obvious. So this painting is the result of one of my walks that I made along Offa's Dyke, and also I paid a visit to Radnor Forest because I'd heard that the views are absolutely astounding. So the locations were duly spectacular, and they helped me to navigate and understand better the connection really between Wales and England's borders. And for me, this painting is an unfolding of different landscapes of many millions of years. It's glaciers, waterfalls, and earth forming from the remnants of animal carcasses, fossilized remains, and rotted trees. And in a funny way, I think it sort of reminds me of places I've already visited, like Iceland. There's something reminiscent to me of the Icelandic landscape. And I think clearly I've used a similar palette of colors, of mainly browns and blues, with a pale yellow undercoat. And ochre is often used, or yellow ochre is often used as an undercoat for landscape paintings. Sidney Nolan's Celtic Heads, this magnificent painting on the right, had only been exhibited once before in Ireland, and the exhibition was organised by Professor David Ferry. So having my exhibition alongside these magnificent works of Nolan was really incredibly exciting, and they seem to fit really well together. The Celtic Head series is made with spray painting, and it reveals Nolan's willingness really to continue experimenting later into his life. He was always curious, and this series was an exploration into his Irish roots and Celtic mythology. He was fascinated by ancient history and otherworldly landscapes, and by the indelible marks left by early Ice Age humans. So the area that inspired him is called the Burren, and it's littered with ancient structures dating back to 4000 BC. And there are believed to be structures, so that river I told you about, the Hindwell Brook, that area also was full of ancient Neolithic structures. So you can sort of see why Nolan was so fascinated by that whole area and why he wanted to buy the house and live there and work there. So I was also very aware of the Pleistocene, which I've mentioned before, which affected the landscape around the rod. And I became fascinated by the realization that sea creatures are literally embedded in every inch of this location. So my painting, Ochre Landscape Dreamed, is made with red ochre, apart from a tiny little bit of lapis at the top, on the sort of top right-hand corner. Of course, the widest variety of ochres can be found in Australia and has deep significance for the Aboriginals as part of their dreaming and creation myths and rituals. So not far from the rod, or relatively not far, is a site called Clearwell Caves. It's in the Forest of Dean, and it's the last remaining ochre mine in Britain, and it was a mecca for prehistoric humans who traveled great distances from England, from northern Scotland, and even across from Europe when it was easy to actually get across because there were shallow areas that you could easily navigate across. And they went to the ochre mine and they collected red, yellow, and purple ochre. I think it's possibly, I don't know, I gather it's quite difficult to find purple ochre that easily. So it had a great sort of significance, and it was used as currency around the world. So ochre can be found in virtually every single region of the world, interestingly. And it was considered to be important because of its particular properties. Believe it or not, ochre was used as sunscreen to protect the skin on long journeys. It was also used as a poultice mixed with leaves to heal external and internal wounds. It was used as an iron supplement by pregnant women and also as a glue, because when you mix red ochre with the gum from the acacia trees, it makes a strong sort of super glue-like adhesive that could fix arrowheads to a shaft. So it's really amazing when you look at it. And it sort of changes how you view these pigments. They were much more than, you know, sort of things that you use to paint on cave walls or to make decorative, sort of artistic decoration out of. But they were literally a crucial part of our existence. So yes, I find that really, really interesting about them. I've also foraged materials to make inks, and that includes oak galls from oak trees, and they're created by small wasps that inject a substance into the tree, and then it reacts by making these round galls. You can sort of see some of them here in the middle. Those are a slightly different type of wasp. So depending on the type of wasp and where the injection is, I think that those are from acorns. So they make these rather funny, rough shapes. But if you want a really perfect oak gall, which looks like a marble, then those are the best. They make the best ink, actually. They've got the highest amount of tannin in them. So the other things that I use are walnuts. I've got a walnut tree on my drive, which is great. And also saffron that I've talked about, which you can see, that amazing yellow is actually saffron. And that's saffron to the far bottom left as well. That's in the pan. That's after I've sort of drained it off, and that's the residue, which looks really beautiful in itself. I also, if I mix mineral pigments, water down, and bind it with gum arabic, it sort of creates a sort of an ink. So I also use that too. And you can see examples up there in the sketchbook. It's pretty amazing what you can do with natural plants, and even, you know, things like onions. The only thing is a lot of them are fugitive, but there are some that have been used for centuries. So oak gall and walnut will last a lot longer, and was used specifically for important manuscripts, like the Magna Carta, for example. So these were actually the inks I created. Became a series of what I called imagined landscapes. And they look like this. That it's on handmade paper, actually paper that's made out of old T-shirts originally. And you can see how beautiful those pigments are. They're absolutely gorgeous. And they look much better in reality, I can tell you. So I've also included some torn paper, and just simple marks, really. A lot of these are done from memory, having walked around the landscape, and hence the title, Imagined Landscapes. And these are the raw materials that I use to make the paint, the oil paint. So these pigments can be prepared by foraging some of them or buying them ready prepared. For example, lapis, which is incredibly difficult to make yourself. There are several medieval recipes, which I'm sure you know about, Roy, being an expert on colour. There's a famous recipe by Giannini, and it actually sounds quite absurd, his recipe, because you mix it, you turn it, you create a dough out of linseed oil and wax. You grind up the lapis, which looks very grey actually, because I've done it myself. I haven't done the whole recipe, but I've ground it up to see what it looks like, because it has lots of things called inclusions. So you can't immediately extract that amazingly mesmerizing blue. You have to go through a whole long process. And Giannini's recipe involved kneading it endlessly for weeks on end. It's quite funny, really. And then you would then go through another kneading process in a bucket of water until the finer particles would start to disperse out of the dough into the water. And that's what you would then eventually strain and use. That would be this beautiful blue color. And all the heavier particles that you don't want, including the inclusions, would remain in the dough. So that was the theory behind that. But obviously, now that we live in 2023, we've got much better ways of doing it.
Is lapis used in any commercial?
Sorry?
Is lapis used in any artist work?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, but they tend to be more specialist. I mean, most paints are synthetically made now, even lapis. So the version of that would be ultramarine, which is probably... No, lapis will be called lapis. Right. So a lot of over the centuries, we've worked out how to actually make synthetic versions of many of these, because some of them are bordering on the toxic. Not lapis, that's not toxic. In fact, lapis, interestingly, was used by the ancient Egyptians. It was mixed with various substances, and then it was put around the eye to protect against infection. So this is the other fascinating thing about pigments. They had lots of different uses apart from art. So, you know, this is maybe why I've put these two together, because these are probably the two most key pigments, I'd say, in terms of the very many other uses that they have, you know, being anti sort of bacterial, ochre too, being used as a sort of like a bandage in a way, being an iron supplement, etc., etc. So the process of collecting, foraging. So this is actually iron oxide, which is a type of ochre which is foraged over here in England. And then I've been able to prepare this myself, and that's a bit of a process, but it's a lot easier. So you basically you collect it usually from riverbeds, it's silt, or occasionally from cliffs. And then you soak it in water and you float off anything you don't want, any organic stuff like dead leaves and stuff. And then you go through a sort of process of sieving it until you end up with a fine powder. And that's the stuff that you can actually mull with oil, linseed oil, and turn that into oil paint. This is the final exhibition. This is Dreaming the Land, up on the walls in the library at the Sidney Nolan Trust. So I made around 40 works in total. Obviously not all of them could be hung. So I think there were about 32 that ended up being hung. And this is the adjacent exhibition. So this is in the main gallery, the Celtic series. These are the Sidney Nolan spray paintings. And, you know, I feel that the contrast between Nolan's powerful monochrome spray painting, which obviously was more of a synthetic, probably sort of acrylic-based modern paint, essentially, with my more delicate pigment and ink paintings and drawings. But we also share the same sort of references to mythology and prehistory, and they just seem to complement each other very well. So that takes me to this painting, which is it's the end of the talk, and it's the painting that inspired the title of the exhibition, Dreaming the Land. And it's obviously a mystical flying creature rising up out of a primordial landscape, which is sort of evolving out of ochres, lapis, lazuli, and malachite. That's that sort of greeny pigment, which is copper, comes from copper. This is one of the views at the Rod that greatly inspired Nolan. That view was one of the very first slides that I showed you. Directly from the Rod, you can see it. There's a whole string of hills, and every single day they would look different depending on the weather. So I made lots of sketches of that same view over different months, and that was interesting to see how it kept changing, and I could understand why Nolan loved it so much. And that brings us to the end of the talks.